Chapter 2 Blood Meals. It was late afternoon when I came upon a carved wooden sign, gray as driftwood but legible. Kenneally Retreat Center. Up a steep gravel path lay a long single-story dark wood structure. It reminded me of an old children's summer camp, or maybe a run-down motel on one of those roads that used to be the main highway before they built the interstate. As I climbed up the hill, I felt eyes tracking my progress. Inside my chest, something jerked, hard and insistent. But I'd come too far and played it safe for too long. I was tired of wandering, fearing everyone, yet half crazed from isolation, following a road that led to nothing more than another day. Sure enough, as I topped the hill, I saw an old man sitting on the front porch. He was watching me. He sat in a weathered green sofa chair, and his hair was long and grayish. It might have been white, but there were oily streaks. His beard was wild, his hands dark and sooty around the knuckles. His blue eyes were set deep inside wrinkled sockets. His clothes, well-worn jeans and a light blue flannel shirt, were clean, which made me self-conscious about my own. I nodded at him, but he only stared. I left the shopping cart, climbed up on the porch, and took a seat some distance away. I am no one you need to worry about. No one. I'm Elon, I said after a while. Don't mean any trouble. I was hoping I might stay the night, maybe a couple. That is, if you don't think you'd mind too much. I looked at him, showing an earnest, unthreatening smile. He said nothing. He looked back down the hill I'd climbed, as if he expected a procession of others. But the path was quiet. The sun was descending, and the trees were alive with birds in their last frenzy before nightfall. I wondered sometimes what the conquest of the ocean had meant for migratory birds. Were the places they wintered or summered now under water? A changing climate makes migrants of the living world. But Earth's other species have always seemed much better prepared and more orderly than man. My legs, now that they'd stopped moving, felt a dull ache deep down in the muscles. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, a temporary act of trust, or maybe just fatigue. This might be the place. When I opened my eyes again, I saw that the old man had not turned in my direction. He sat quite still, his calloused hands folded as if in prayer. His gaze remained on the gravel path. It took an effort not to talk, not to strike up a conversation. The customs differed now. If a man wanted to talk, he would, but it was never advisable to push. So he sat in silence for a long time, just watching the sun dip below the horizon. I heard the tiny crack of branches and a rustling in the woods toward the back of the building. Deer, maybe? It had been a long time since I'd seen any. It was as if the animals had sensed the human madness and withdrawn deeper into the forest. The old man's calm face and lack of comment inspired a simple hope. A night indoors, sheltered from rain or wind, safe from predators. At the same time, my stomach moaned. I wondered if the man had food he would share. I retrieved a rotten crabapple from the cart and began to eat, then held a second one and made a motion as if to pitch it to him. He did not respond except to shuffle inside. By and by he returned with a knife and a slab of meat the size of a dinner plate. He carried the meat in his bare hands, the blood running down his tanned arms. There was an old stone fireplace outside fitted with an iron grill and surrounded by a circle of rocks 20 yards or so to the side of the porch. He deposited the meat on a nearby tree stump and gathered kindling from a pile of battered furniture. It was clear he knew how to get a fire going. I watched him cook the meat, venison, I guessed. He still hadn't said a word. I wasn't expecting any of his food, but the smoky smell of the meat and the hissing and spitting of the fat in the flames made me light-headed. When the meat had cooked to his liking, he removed it from the fire, slapped it back on the tree stump, and cut it in two with a knife. He took a piece, then nodded at me. "Go on," he said. I reached over and took the other piece. "Thank you. Thank you." I was stunned by the prospect of meat. I could not think what else to say. The air drained from my lungs, leaving a whisper. "Thank you." He nodded. We held the meat in our hands, the warm grease running down our fingers and arms, burning a little. We ate together without a word. I don't remember anything that ever tasted so good. Flies buzzed around me, but I barely noticed them. I could not control myself. Each large, noisy bite sent a rush of protein through my starving veins, a sensation my body had forgotten. Oh God, slow down. You'll vomit or choke to death. A crazy image flitted through my brain, an old man who seizes up and dies during sex with a much younger woman. She screams and rolls away, and that is how they find his body, rigid and disgraced. That would be me if I died this instant. Still, I ate faster. I ate the fat. I ate the gristle. I would have eaten the bone if my teeth possessed the strength. When I'd finished, I sat back on the grass, catching my breath, staring up into the darkening sky and wiping the grease from my face and hands with my shirt sleeves. I felt enormous relief, the kind of ease that follows sex when it's been a long while, which it had been. No wonder the image was in my head. In the first weeks of flight, I still felt the urge, the rush of blood at the sight, even the thought of a woman. Gradually, the daily necessities of food and shelter took all of the bandwidth I had. Desire receded inside my weakened body. The old man appeared with a pitcher of water, and he poured some on his hands and wiped his face and arms, then waved his arm in my direction. "There's plenty enough," he said. "Enough for now." It was the most he'd spoken. His voice was gravelly, a little hoarse, and he breathed heavily after the last phrase. Then he sighed, pitched another piece of broken furniture onto the fire, and leaned back, staring into the flames. Rinsing my hands, I cupped the left one, filled it with water, and brought it to my mouth, slurping noisily. "Wouldn't stay out much longer," he said. "Gets cold. There's rooms and bedding inside. Just don't take anything when you leave." I promised I wouldn't, and he walked slowly back to the porch. I heard a screen door swing open and then clap shut. I was still dizzy from the meat. The old man's sharing of his food cut through my instinctual fear. Why would he feed me if he planned to kill me? What'd be the point? My shopping cart stood a short distance from the porch, and I walked over and grabbed shirts and long pants so crusted in mud and filth that nothing remained of their original colors. Then I backtracked, maneuvering the whole cart to the porch and up the steps, then awkwardly through the doorway. A residual distrust still lingered. What if someone else found the cart and stole its contents? Too pathetic to call property, yet all I have in the world. Inside the building, a single candle burned on a tall stick. I paused a moment to watch and breathe in the hypnotic smell of the wax. It had been many months since I'd stared into the twitch and stutter of a candle flame. The dim light revealed the outlines of an old sofa and some folding chairs and a few tables. It resembled the reception area of a cheap motel, but without the check-in desk. Opposite the sofas and chairs was a small kitchen area with a sink and cupboards. A short entrance led past the kitchen and reception areas ending in a T, where a long hallway extended to the right and left. I pushed my cart as quietly as I could to the left, passing half a dozen or so numbered rooms on both sides. I kept going until I reached the exit sign at the end of the hall and took the last room. If there was trouble, I could make a run for it. In a savage world, you learn that about yourself. You are either a fighter or a runner. I didn't like the answer and the shame that went with it, but I accepted the truth. I am a runner. Inside, it was so dark I could not tell the room's dimensions. I stumbled forward and clawed at something that turned out to be a window shade. The moonlight would help me settle down, but I opened it just a crack so as not to give away any sign of life. I stretched my arms out, reaching for a bed. But as I walked forward, my boot stumbled over something on the floor, and I fell, landing on a stiff mattress topped with blankets. They smelled faintly of old mothballs, but I sprawled out and fell asleep before I could take off my boots. I slept a long time and woke, certain I had cried out during the night. There was a phantom vibration in my throat, and a panic radiating from my chest. My breathing calmed. What nightmare this time? The unmistakable evidence of death, bones, cadavers, a pool of blood in a muddy depression, and none of it could be banished from the subconscious, where it seemed to play in a loop. Thin strands of sunlight poured through holes in the window shade, and I realized I was indoors and it was morning. When I looked up, I saw no clouds or sun above, just a ceiling of cobwebs and cracked white paint. It had been a long time since I thought of God, but I thought of him now. Is it death I've come to? The next life? My eyes took in a room with 4 white walls. I touched my face. I was awake and wearing the clothes I'd fallen asleep in. On one shirt sleeve was a smear of grease, and when I pulled the sleeve to my face, the smoky smell of venison was overpowering. I changed into what passed for fresh clothing, another shirt and pair of pants so filthy they looked as if they'd been dragged over a red clay road. For a while, I lay on the mattress, reconstructing the previous day, sifting through possibilities and pondering divine intervention. What had brought me to this place? One of 2 things, chance or God. My childhood was not a Jewish childhood, as I imagined one to be. On Fridays, my mother's parents lit the candles at sunset, said the blessings, and drank the sugary wine from the kiddush cup. My mother, however, fell away from the faith. An act of rebellion? Forgetfulness? Fatigue? Disillusionment? I couldn't say. She seldom talked about religion. In her home, Friday night reruns of Happy Days and Hill Street Blues replaced the candles and wine. On occasion, someone who knew her parents would ask my mother if she were still a practicing Jew, to which she replied, "Not really." My own feelings were shaped by the good and bad events in life, which I connected in some way to God, and whether I'd pleased or failed him. It was a loose construct, a conversation inside my head that faded in my adult years. Belief remained, but for long stretches the conversation went silent. Perhaps my mother had experienced the same. That doubt, once a creeping sensation, now felt urgent. What if there really is no one listening when we plead for help? Dressed, I rose and stretched, painfully aware of the smell that followed me everywhere, the kind of heavy odor you might find in a bus station bathroom, or the tiger cage at the zoo. I feared it might be bad enough that the old man would send me on my way. Speaking of which, where is he? I wheeled my cart into the hallway and slowly made my way toward the entrance, passing 5 other closed doors with numbers on them. Near the entrance I saw an open door, and inside a small bunk, bedding askew, floor littered with clothes. The occupant was gone. I resisted the impulse to take a closer look. It was remarkable that he'd left the door open, willing to risk the possibility that he would return and find everything gone. That was trust. Unless this is a test. Unless he is waiting close by, armed and ready to catch me in the act of stealing. Here, after all, was a man who had not volunteered his name or any of his story. My wild, filthy condition might have given him cause to wonder just what manner of man he'd encountered. The need to reassure him, and myself, that I had not lost my humanity led me back to my task for the day, to find water. I would bathe and wash my clothes. I would earn the old man's trust, and with it perhaps another meal, maybe even another night sheltered from the elements. I glanced at the sleeves of my cooling shirt, 100% polyester, now 100% sweat and dried blood. Then I set off into the woods behind the building, pushing the cart filled with clothes, feeling the wheels twist and grind and buckle over rocks and sticks. I listened intently. I might hear water before I saw it. Layers of pine needles covered the forest floor, cushioning my boots, but pushing the cart around the fallen trees made it slow going. The sun beamed through the jack pines, a warmth that surrounded me and lit the way forward. Even so, with only the smallest shift in perspective, warmth became heat, a reminder of the end the sun was bringing, the end we'd brought on ourselves. I struggled with my anger. It smoldered in my stomach. It was the recurring rant that swept in like the tide. I could never forgive the smug certainty of those who dismissed the climate warnings, some of them people I knew, some of them family. One of them, my mother. I can hear her still. "It's hysteria, and you're a fool to take it seriously. When I was a girl, it was the bomb. Duck and cover. We were doomed, all of us. Then nothing happened and we got over it." "But this is different," I argued. "Ask yourself, Why would so many scientists say the same thing? She never did ask or answer the question. The last time I saw her several years ago, she stood her ground, an aging woman in a housecoat shaking her head, laughing at the ball of glowing gases 92 million miles away. The image reminds me also of my own feeling, at least where she was concerned. In my haste to leave Rhode Island, I never phoned to ask whether, in the climate exodus, she planned to leave Maine or stay. The conversation would be awkward, I rationalized. She'd felt my resentment burning the air between us. With that memory shadowing me, I let my own outrage pass. In the end, what does it matter? What satisfaction is there from being right? Besides, what right have I to the moral high ground when I failed to change my gas-guzzling, wasteful behavior? In the shadow of the high ground exists the shame of having left the saving of Earth to others. The sun burns down on all, believer and non-believer. Each day something reminds me of this fact. Shriveled caterpillar, dry riverbed, smell of melting asphalt. I guessed I might be close to the Huron-Manistee National Forest, land rich with rivers and streams. I figured if I walked far enough, I was sure to stumble across the Pere Marquette River. My family had camped here when I was a child. The ragged tent, the Coleman stove, the mornings fishing with my father as he worked his way through a six-pack of Bud, pulling one can after another from the plastic ring. The land itself is the best, most enduring memory. After hiking a couple of hours, I heard the sound. No phantom, but the real thing, of water rushing over rocks. I followed and came to a break in the trees. And there it was, a wide brook. Soon I'd stripped off my clothes and was rolling in the bracing water, scrubbing vigorously at weeks of accumulated grime and feeling a numbness spread over my skin. I soaked my clothes and squeezed the water from them, then went through all the motions again until I felt I'd gotten as much of the stink out of the material as I could. At last I laid the clothes on some rocks and let the midday sun dry them. While I waited, I sat taking in the brook and its soft, marshy banks. For the first months of my migration, for most of my life in fact, I'd felt vulnerable, anxious, and uncomfortable without the protective cover of clothes. But that feeling had vanished. At this moment, free of clothes, my skin was clean and new. I looked at myself as I hadn't in quite some time. I saw the bones of a man, 5'10", no sign of the paunch that once ringed the waist, but also a scarcity of muscle in the arms and shoulders. I appeared as I imagined a stranded desert islander would, someone long divorced from civilization. I stayed by the brook for what seemed like several hours, and when the sun began its descent, I gathered my clothes. My pants and shirt were still damp as I struggled into them. I didn't care. I didn't even mind the whine of mosquitoes hovering near my ears, insane with hunger for meals of blood. The landmarks I'd passed would lead me back to a second night under a roof, and maybe a full belly. When I emerged from the woods and could see the retreat center again, something had changed. I felt the presence of others, unknown eyes watching, the same sensation I'd experienced when I approached the retreat center under the old man's gaze. I neared the building and looked around in time to see the curtain over one of the windows ripple where a face had been. Resentment burned, the fear that I might be forced to move on to avoid a threat. I walked toward the front of the building, and as I did, I saw the old man climbing back along the hilly path. He carried something slung over his shoulders. I waited. "You see him?" he asked as he reached me. It was a rifle he held in one hand. In the other, 2 ducks, both plucked clean. Their skin looked pale and faintly blue. I stared at them until the old man snapped his fingers. I hesitated, uncertain what he was asking. "Them?" "Them," he repeated. "The others." "I think so. I thought I felt someone watching, and when I turned, the curtain rustled." "Well," he said, "I suspicioned someone had come. There was tracks and broken brush about 1.5 miles back. I figured they was heading this way. They'd find the place for sure." He didn't seem worried. Perhaps there had been others. I wished I hadn't left my binoculars in the room. Many nights I slept holding on to them. They were the only means I had of spotting trouble before it was on me. "Should we call them out?" I asked. "Nope," the old man said. Stay on the porch until supper. If they don't show before then, they'll come when they smell the fire. So we sat on the porch for a second day, watching the heavy sun lean into the horizon, shading it pink and amber before finally slipping out of sight. We gathered wood. I told the old man about the small amount of gas I carried. He had his own. He threw down the kindling, then topped it with several long planks of wood. I wondered where he'd found them. He hadn't found them at all. When I looked back at the building waiting for someone to appear at the door, I saw what I'd missed earlier. Boards had been ripped away from the sides of the porch. Only a few so far, but enough that I couldn't help thinking about the hard choices facing the old man. Facing us all. He was right. The flames were high, and he was getting ready to put the ducks on when a human outline appeared in the darkened doorway, then another a few feet behind. They watched, and so did we, holding back, trying not to spook one another, unsure what to say. I made no sudden movements and curled my lips in an attempt at a warm smile. I leaned in close to the old man. "What do you think?" "Well, I've seen plenty to give me pause," he said. "But these two don't look like trouble. Look more like they've had a hard go of it themselves." I smiled back at the visitors and nodded. In the darkness and firelight, it was hard to tell how the gestures would translate. After a while, though, the taller of the two raised a hand, and the old man raised one back. The two strangers moved out from the doorway and came slowly forward into the firelight. "Asher," the man said. I could see his ragged beard, a tangle much like my own, only red instead of brown. He was tall and very thin. The outline of his ribs jutted out through a faded gray t-shirt. He wore a light brown coat over the top. His jeans looked like the road. There were dark smears across the legs that could have been anything. Grease, river muck, blood. I guessed that Asher was in his early 30s. "We haven't eaten in 2 days," he said, nodding at his shorter companion who had approached tentatively and now stood a few steps behind Asher. "Amira's having problems." He swirled a hand around his stomach. Amira couldn't have been older than 19 or 20. She was thin, with long brown hair pulled back from her tanned and dirty face, and tied behind her head with some sort of scrunchie. When Asher spoke, she said nothing, simply staring through us, those dark, hollow eyes looking at something that might be a million miles away. "She'd been drinking a lot of water, but I think there was something bad in that stream we stopped at a couple of nights ago," Asher said. I took it to mean she was suffering from the runs, an affliction I knew all too well. A month ago, it must have been, I drank bad pond water, and my bowels went into overdrive until I was weak and dehydrated, my whole body a sputtering engine. "I'm from northern Florida, little place called Jasper," Asher continued. "She's from Georgia, somewhere up around Albany. We met heading north toward Chicago." He paused before adding, "When we got closer to Chicago, we changed our minds." Asher looked as if he might say more, but he didn't. Whatever had caused them to turn around was nothing he cared to get into. "I'm Elon," I said. "I took off from Rhode Island during Amber. Never saw what happened when Matthias hit. I expect that where I lived is ocean now. I try to imagine it sometimes, but I just can't." "Yeah, I guess where I come from, there wasn't much to make a man sentimental," Asher said. "I miss a light you can switch on, a glass of water that's ice cold, but there's stuff that's better off under water. Some people, too." It was a harsh judgment, and no one said much after that. I knew what he meant, though. As for the old man, he still gave away nothing about himself, even if he'd come from somewhere else. And there was something in those eyes, maybe the reflection of the fire in them, that discouraged questions. His deep voice, on the other hand, resonated with kindness, or so I imagined. "You all are welcome to some meat," he said, gesturing to his new visitors. "Looks like you could use some." "We'd be grateful, me and Amira. Like I said, we haven't eaten in a couple of days." We settled around the fire, the ducks crackling in the flames as the old man cooked them. After a short time, when the meat was brown and juicy, he removed the ducks, laid each one on the tree stump, and sliced each in half. We ate in silence, directing all our energy to the flavors flooding our dulled taste buds. I thought of all the things I'd eaten on the road, and all the things I'd tried to eat. I'd gagged on dead crickets and vomited up a mouthful of moss and leaves. After a while, food was purely a necessity, a fire that had to be put out each day. There was seldom pleasure in it. Feasting on the ducks that night felt like the reawakening of an old memory, the time when food was a privilege, not a universal struggle. When Asher finished his meat, he looked across at Amira, who was lethargic and ate with little enthusiasm. I knew what he was thinking. It took willpower not to ask if she'd finished with her food, and more willpower not to consume her share before she could answer. Hunger devours the desire to be good. But Asher looked away. He distracted himself from her food and from her indifference to it. If she allowed herself to get much thinner, her body would begin to turn upon itself, consuming its reserves. Eventually, her gut would swell, and she would take on that oddly bloated appearance of a famine victim. I'd seen that look up close. On a college mission, classmates and I spent 2 weeks delivering food and aid to refugee camps in Turkey, near the Syrian border. I'd seen the faces of people too sick with dysentery, too drained to reach for a handful of rice. In the last year, I'd come to know that feeling firsthand. On Amira's face and in her eyes, I read revulsion. The sight of food sickened her, and she looked away. The fire was winding down, and she lay her head on Asher's lap, closing her eyes as she did so. I looked up toward the stars, but clouds had moved in, obscuring the moon and much of the night sky. There were yelps and howls in the distance, wolves, possibly coyotes. The contrast between the cold brook water earlier in the day and the warm fire now left my eyelids drooping, my breathing a deep, rhythmic pre-sleep. I rose, tipped my baseball cap, and left the young couple and the old man staring into the dying embers. Once again, I pushed my cart inside the retreat center and camped out in the same room at the end of the hall. This time I undressed, feeling a little less guarded than the previous night. I left the window shade up. The clouds had shifted enough so that I could see the crescent moon. I thought of my mother explaining the moon's cycle many years ago, before she began to view science with hostility. The crescent shape marked the waxing of the new moon as it emerges from the sun's shadow. For as long as I could remember, that shape made me think of beginnings. That night I thought of the white walls around me, the first room I'd had since I abandoned my apartment. And I remembered that 1,000 miles away I'd left behind a bedroom, a framed print of Point Judith Lighthouse, a kitchen cupboard full of pasta and jarred sauce, a solid oak bookcase with signed copies of the Shipping News and Angela's Ashes, all of it belonging now to the Atlantic Ocean. I lay down, and even before my head hit the mattress, I'd fallen into the deepest sleep imaginable.